Sandra Dawson's life appeared to be the epitome of suburban bliss. She and her husband, Robert, had spent nearly 2 decades together, carving out a comfortable existence. Their mornings were a familiar routine. Robert would leave for his senior management job at the prestigious firm where he worked, and Sandra would linger in the warmth of their kitchen, sipping coffee while contemplating her next volunteer project or painting. Their home was a sanctuary, filled with the echoes of shared laughter and quiet moments. Robert was diligent, always focused on his work, and dependable to a fault. He provided for them well, ensuring they wanted for nothing. Sandra, meanwhile, had ample time to pursue her passions. Yet, despite the veneer of contentment, something inside her was shifting. The life she once cherished now felt predictable, almost suffocating. Sandra longed for something more, something thrilling, something dangerous. She sought it in small, seemingly harmless ways at first. A new workout routine at the gym that pushed her limits, art classes that brought a spark of excitement, and eventually, more subtle escapes. It was during one of these escapes that she met Edward Mason, Robert's boss. Their first encounter was at a company event, one of those tedious dinners where the wives were expected to smile politely and make small talk. But Edward was different. He commanded the room with an ease that fascinated Sandra. He was confident, bold, with a sharp wit that made her laugh in a way she hadn't in years. Edward noticed her too. At first, it was just a glance across the table, a fleeting moment. But as the evening wore on, their conversations grew more personal. He complimented her dress, her smile, the way she carried herself. It was intoxicating. Sandra found herself drawn to him in ways she couldn't explain, her pulse quickening whenever he was near. What began as innocent flirtation quickly took on a life of its own. They started meeting for coffee, then for lunches, always careful to keep their interactions hidden from prying eyes. But soon, it wasn't enough. The stolen glances turned into touches, the touches into embraces, and before long, they were embroiled in a full-blown affair. Sandra knew it was wrong. The guilt gnawed at her, but she buried it deep, justifying her actions as a necessary escape from the monotony of her life with Robert. She told herself she deserved this excitement, this break from the ordinary. But deep down, she knew the truth. She was betraying the man who had given her everything. For Edward, the affair was little more than a game. He enjoyed the thrill of seducing his subordinate's wife, of asserting his power in yet another aspect of his life. To him, Sandra was just another conquest, a means to an end. He saw Robert as weak, someone to be pitted, and by extension, Sandra was just a diversion, a way to entertain himself. Sandra tried to ignore the emptiness that followed each encounter, the way Edward's eyes would glaze over as soon as their time together was done. She convinced herself that she could keep the affair separate from the rest of her life, that Robert would never find out, and that no one was getting hurt. But as the weeks went by, the cracks in her perfect life began to widen. The thrill that had once electrified her was now a source of constant anxiety. The guilt she had tried so hard to suppress began to surface, and with it, the fear that her carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down. Sandra didn't know it yet, but the path she had chosen would lead to a reckoning far beyond anything she could have imagined. The signs were there, but they started small, almost imperceptible. At first, Robert Dawson brushed them off as the natural ebb and flow of a long marriage. Sandra seemed a little distracted, her thoughts elsewhere during their conversations. She laughed less, and when she did, it seemed forced. He noticed she was spending more time out of the house, at the gym, with friends, or running errands that took longer than they used to. It was the phone that first caught Robert's attention. Sandra had always been open with her phone, leaving it on the kitchen counter or the living room table. But now, it was different. The phone was always with her, and she started silencing notifications or stepping out of the room when a call came in. Once, Robert reached for it to check the time, and Sandra nearly jumped out of her seat to grab it from him. "Everything okay?" Robert had asked, raising an eyebrow. "Just a work thing," Sandra replied quickly, too quickly. She forced a smile, but her eyes were darting around, avoiding his gaze. "You know how these charity events are, always something coming up." Robert nodded, but the unease settled in his gut like a lead weight. He tried to shake it off, telling himself that Sandra was just busy, maybe a little stressed. But then came the late nights. It began with a few evenings where Sandra didn't come home until after midnight. She'd claim she had meetings, that she lost track of time while catching up with a friend over coffee. But the excuses started piling up, each more flimsy than the last. Robert noticed the smell of a different cologne on her clothes, a scent that wasn't his. One night, after Sandra had slipped into bed well past midnight, Robert lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He could feel the distance between them, a chasm that had once been filled with love and laughter, now replaced by silence and doubt. His heart ached, and a voice in the back of his mind whispered the truth he wasn't ready to face. But Robert wasn't a man to jump to conclusions. He needed to be sure, to have undeniable proof before he let himself believe that his wife was unfaithful. He began to watch her more closely, noting every little change, every suspicious behavior. When Sandra started receiving calls late at night, she'd step out of the room, speaking in hushed tones. Robert started pretending to be asleep, but his ears were always tuned in, catching snippets of conversations that made his stomach churn. One evening, when Sandra left the house claiming she was meeting a friend, Robert decided to follow her. He kept a safe distance, driving cautiously as she made her way to a restaurant on the other side of town. She parked, and Robert watched from his car as Sandra walked inside. Moments later, Edward Mason arrived. They embraced, a long, intimate hug that sent a dagger through Robert's heart. They took a private booth, laughing and leaning in close to each other. Robert's hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. He sat there, frozen, watching the two of them through the restaurant window. The truth was in front of him now, undeniable and cruel. His wife was having an affair with his boss. When Sandra returned home that night, Robert didn't confront her. Instead, he greeted her with a forced smile, his voice steady. "Did you have a good time?" "Yeah," she said, not meeting his eyes. "It was nice to catch up." As she headed upstairs to bed, Robert lingered in the living room, his mind racing. The hurt was overwhelming, but beneath it was a growing sense of resolve. Confronting her would only lead to a messy, emotional argument. He'd lose control, and Edward might retaliate. No, Robert needed a plan, something calculated, something that would make them both pay for the betrayal. The next day, Robert began quietly collecting evidence. He went through Sandra's phone while she showered, taking photos of texts and call logs. He noted every time she left the house and followed her when he could. The more he uncovered, the more his hurt hardened into cold, unyielding anger. Robert knew he couldn't act impulsively. He needed to bide his time, to let his plan take shape. As he retreated into himself, Sandra noticed, but she didn't question it. She assumed he was just busy with work, maybe a little distant, but she didn't care enough to dig deeper. But Robert cared, and he was preparing for the storm that was about to break. The summer evening was deceptively peaceful, but inside the Dawson household, tension simmered beneath the surface. The smell of roasting chicken wafted through the house, a meal Sandra had carefully prepared for Robert's birthday. But as she stirred the gravy, her thoughts weren't on her husband, they were on Edward Mason. Sandra had planned the evening meticulously. She had told Edward to pick her up after dinner, a bold move that both thrilled and terrified her. The idea of her lover walking into her home, meeting her husband, sent a shiver down her spine. It was reckless, but that was part of the allure. As she set the table, she glanced at the clock, the seconds ticking away, each one bringing Edward closer. When Robert arrived home, he was his usual self, calm, composed, with no hint that anything was amiss. He kissed Sandra on the cheek, thanking her for the effort she put into dinner. "Smells amazing," he said, taking a seat at the table. His voice was steady, his demeanor unchanged, but there was a hollowness in his eyes that Sandra didn't notice. She was too preoccupied with her own thoughts, too distracted by the anticipation of what was to come. They ate in near silence, the clinking of cutlery the only sound between them. Sandra's mind was miles away, replaying her last encounter with Edward, thinking about what the night would bring. She kept stealing glances at the clock, her foot tapping impatiently under the table. Every minute felt like an eternity, her excitement tinged with anxiety. Robert noticed her distraction, but he said nothing. He methodically cut his chicken, chewed, and swallowed, all the while observing Sandra with a quiet intensity. She was jittery, her smile forced, her eyes never quite meeting his. He knew where her mind was, who she was thinking about. The knowledge sat heavy in his chest, but he pushed the emotion down, focusing instead on the plan that had been forming in his mind for weeks. Finally, the doorbell rang. The sound cut through the room like a knife, making Sandra jump. Her heart raced as she excused herself, muttering something about the dessert. Robert watched her leave, his expression unreadable. He heard her footsteps quicken as she approached the door, and he took a deep breath, steadying himself. When Sandra opened the door, there stood Edward, looking as smug as ever. He didn't bother with greetings or pleasantries. Instead, he stepped forward, grabbed Sandra by the waist, and kissed her deeply. The audacity of it made Sandra's heart pound, both with fear and a twisted kind of excitement. "Happy birthday, Robert," Edward called out over Sandra's shoulder as they walked into the living room, his voice dripping with mockery. "Your wife is mine tonight, and that's final. Hope you don't lose your job, dumbass." The words hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. Edward's arrogance was palpable, his smirk infuriating. Sandra forced a nervous laugh, trying to match his bravado, but inside she was trembling. This wasn't how she had imagined it. She had thought there would be a thrill in the danger, a rush of adrenaline, but instead, she felt sick to her stomach. Robert stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. His face was pale, but his expression was calm, controlled. He looked at Edward, then at Sandra, taking in the scene before him. The silence stretched on, the tension unbearable. Finally, Robert spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Sandra, why don't you go get the dessert?" Sandra blinked, caught off guard by his tone. She hesitated, glancing at Edward, who shrugged with a grin. "Sure," she said, her voice shaky. She turned and hurried to the kitchen, eager to escape the heavy atmosphere. As she disappeared into the kitchen, Robert and Edward remained in the living room, the air between them thick with unspoken words. Robert's gaze never left Edward, who returned the look with smug confidence. Neither man moved, neither spoke, the unspoken challenge hanging in the balance. Finally, Robert broke the silence. "You've got some nerve, Edward." Edward's grin widened. "I'm just here for a good time, Robert. No hard feelings, right?" Robert's expression didn't change. He simply nodded once, then turned and left the room without another word. Edward watched him go, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. But he quickly shrugged it off, confident in his position. He had won, after all. Or so he thought. Sandra's heart raced as she sat on the edge of the couch, her mind spinning with fear and confusion. Edward lounged beside her, utterly relaxed, his smug confidence unshaken by Robert's strange behavior earlier. He was oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface, a storm that was about to break in ways neither of them could have imagined. From the hallway, the sound of Robert's footsteps echoed, slow and deliberate. Sandra strained to hear, her pulse quickening with each approaching step. She glanced at Edward, who seemed completely unconcerned, as if this were just another power play in his long list of conquests. But Sandra knew Robert, at least, she thought she did, and something about his demeanor tonight had set off alarm bells in her mind. The door creaked open, and Robert stepped into the living room. Sandra's breath caught in her throat as she saw what he was holding. It was a gun, sleek and ominous in his hand. She had never seen it before, and the sight of it in Robert's grasp sent a jolt of terror through her. The room plunged into an uneasy silence, the air thick with tension. Edward, his arrogance momentarily faltering, sat up straighter. "What the hell are you doing, Robert?" he barked, trying to mask the crack in his voice with bravado. But Robert wasn't the same man who had quietly left the room earlier. His eyes were cold, calculating, as if he had already made up his mind. "You're both going to play a game now," he said calmly, his voice steady and devoid of emotion. "And the winner gets to walk out." The words hung in the air, chilling Sandra to her core. She had known Robert for years, shared a life with him. But this man standing before her was a stranger, someone capable of anything. "Robert, please," she whispered, her voice trembling as tears welled up in her eyes. "You don't have to do this." But Robert's gaze never left Edward, who was now visibly shaken. The tables had turned, and the fear in Edward's eyes betrayed the realization that he was no longer in control. "First, get on your knees," Robert ordered, his voice dropping to a menacing growl that left no room for argument. Edward hesitated, his confidence draining away as the reality of the situation settled in. He looked to Sandra for support, but she was as terrified as he was, her mind scrambling for a way out. But there was no escape, no reasoning with the man who stood before them with a gun. Slowly, Edward complied, his bravado collapsing under the weight of the moment. He sank to his knees, his eyes darting nervously between Robert and the gun, searching for some hint of mercy that wasn't there. The power he had wielded so effortlessly was now gone, leaving only fear in its wake. Sandra, shaking uncontrollably, felt her legs give way beneath her. She sank to her knees beside Edward, her mind reeling. The man she had betrayed, the man she thought she knew, was gone, replaced by someone who could do the unthinkable. Her thoughts raced, trying to piece together what had led them to this point, but the answers eluded her. Robert circled them slowly, the gun still in his hand. His movements were methodical, as if he were considering each step with deadly precision. The room was silent except for the sound of Sandra's ragged breathing and Edward's shallow gasps. They both knew there was no talking their way out of this, no words that could defuse the situation. "What do you want, Robert?" Edward finally asked, his voice small, desperate. The bravado that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a man who was terrified for his life. Robert paused, staring down at the two of them with a gaze that was almost unreadable. For a moment, he said nothing, letting the fear fester. Then, in a voice so calm it was chilling, he replied, "I want you to understand what it feels like to lose everything." Sandra's heart shattered as the gravity of his words sank in. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about destroying them, stripping away everything they had taken for granted. She looked up at Robert, hoping for some sign of the man she had once loved, but all she saw was cold resolve. The nightmare had only just begun, and there was no waking up from it. As Sandra knelt beside Edward, the full weight of the situation crushed her. The man she had once known, her quiet, dependable husband, had transformed into something else entirely, a man who was about to exact a horrifying revenge. The room felt like it was closing in on her, each breath harder to take than the last. Robert moved around them with a predatory grace, the gun held steady in his hand. His voice, when he finally spoke, was laced with a venom Sandra had never heard before. "You see, Edward," he began, his words dripping with scorn, "you thought you could take everything from me, my job, my wife, my dignity, but you forgot one thing." He stopped, his gaze boring into Edward. "I have nothing left to lose." The silence that followed was unbearable. Edward, usually so full of himself, now struggled to find his voice. When he finally did, it came out as a croak. "Robert, let's talk about this. You don't have to do anything crazy." But Robert wasn't listening. He was past reasoning, past mercy. "This isn't about talking," he said, his tone almost casual, which made it even more terrifying. "It's about truth, about stripping away all the lies and seeing what's left." He paused, letting his words sink in. "We're going to play a little game." Sandra's heart pounded in her chest as Robert continued, the casualness of his tone at odds with the horror of his words. "Here's how the game works," he explained, slowly circling them like a vulture. "One of you gets to leave here alive. The other doesn't. Simple, right? You'll each take turns telling me a truth about the other. The more painful, the better. The more honest, the better. Whoever convinces me they're the most truthful wins." The room seemed to tilt as Sandra tried to process what Robert was saying. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about destruction. Robert wasn't content with just ending their lives. He wanted to tear them apart first, to expose every ugly truth they had buried. Edward was the first to break. He looked at Sandra, desperation etched on his face. "Sandra, she's been seeing other men too," he blurted out, his voice trembling. I'm not the only one. She's a liar, Robert. She doesn't love you. She never did. The accusation hit Sandra like a physical blow. Her breath caught in her throat, and tears welled up in her eyes. That's not true, she protested, her voice shaking with fear and desperation. I made a mistake, but I never stopped loving you, Robert. Please, you have to believe me. But Robert's face remained stone cold. There was no sign of the man she had once known, no flicker of emotion to suggest that her words had any impact. He simply motioned for her to continue, his eyes like ice. Next, he commanded. Sandra's mind raced as she searched for something, anything, that might save her. Her thoughts were a jumbled mess, but one idea came to the forefront. Edward, he's been stealing from the company, Robert, she said, her voice desperate. He's been laundering money, using his position to cover it up. He's a criminal, a fraud. Edward's face twisted in anger, his eyes narrowing as he prepared to strike back. But before he could say a word, Robert silenced him with a flick of the gun. Enough, he said, his voice hard. The tension in the room was suffocating, the air thick with fear and hatred. Robert looked at both of them, his expression unreadable. Now, you both get to make a choice. You can either turn the gun on each other, or I'll make the decision for you. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Sandra and Edward stared at each other, the weight of the ultimatum pressing down on them. Everything they had done, the lies, the betrayal, the affair, had led them to this moment. The realization was crushing. They were nothing more than pawns in a cruel game, and Robert held all the power. Sandra's hands shook as she looked down at the gun, her mind racing with the impossible choice before her. She had never imagined things would come to this, had never thought that their game of lies would end in such a twisted, deadly way. But now, with Robert standing over them, the reality was undeniable. Robert, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Please, don't make us do this. But Robert didn't respond. He simply stepped back, the gun still in his hand, waiting for them to make their move. The nightmare had only just begun, and there was no way out. The tension in the room was suffocating as Robert placed the gun on the floor between Sandra and Edward. The cold metal gleamed ominously, a cruel symbol of the choice they now faced. Robert took a deliberate step back, his eyes never leaving the two of them. Go ahead, he said, his voice eerily calm. Who wants to live? Who wants to die? Tears blurred Sandra's vision as she reached out for the gun, her hand trembling uncontrollably. Every fiber of her being screamed to grab it, to end this nightmare. But her body felt like it was moving through molasses. Before her fingers could close around the weapon, Edward lunged forward, shoving her roughly aside. He grabbed the gun with a desperate urgency, pointing it at Robert, his face contorted with a mix of fear and anger. You're insane, Robert, Edward yelled, his voice cracking. I'm not playing your sick game. His finger hovered over the trigger, trembling with the weight of the decision. Robert remained unflinching, a cold smile playing on his lips. Are you sure you want to do that, Edward? He asked, his voice laced with dark amusement. Pull that trigger, and you'll be signing your own death warrant. The police will be here soon enough. Do you really think they'll believe you? A man who's been screwing his employee's wife? A man who's been stealing from his own company? Edward's hand wavered, the confidence he had clung to all night crumbling under the weight of Robert's words. The reality of his situation was undeniable. He was trapped, outmaneuvered by the very man he had underestimated. The smug, arrogant boss who had strutted into this house was gone, replaced by a desperate, terrified man grasping at straws. Please, Robert. Sandra's voice was barely more than a whisper as she crawled towards him, her eyes pleading. Don't do this. We can fix this. We can start over. Robert's gaze flicked to her, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a glimmer of the man she had once loved, the man who had been her rock for so many years. But the flicker of hope was extinguished as quickly as it had appeared. You've already made your choices, Robert said, his tone icy. Now it's time to live with them, or die with them. Edward, sensing the finality in Robert's voice, turned the gun towards Sandra. His face was a mask of desperation, his voice shaking as he spoke. You You brought this on us, Sandra. You made me believe this was worth it. It's your fault. Sandra's eyes widened in horror as the barrel of the gun pointed directly at her. Edward, no, please, she begged, her voice breaking. We were in this together. But Edward was beyond reason. The fear of death, the crushing realization of his own downfall, had pushed him to the edge. His thoughts were no longer rational. He was driven by a primal instinct to survive, no matter the cost. Edward. Robert's voice cut through the tension like a knife, sharp and commanding. You think killing her will save you? Go ahead, pull the trigger. But know this, you'll never make it out of here alive. Edward hesitated, his eyes darting between Robert and Sandra, the gravity of Robert's words seeping into his frenzied mind. The logic was undeniable. If he killed Sandra, Robert would surely kill him. Slowly, the gun lowered, his resolve crumbling. What do you want from us, Robert? Edward's voice was a broken whisper, all the bravado drained from him. What do you want me to do? Robert's eyes were as cold as steel, devoid of any empathy. You both disgust me, but I'm giving you one last chance. Put the gun down, Edward. Let's see how much of a man you really are. Edward's grip on the gun loosened, the weight of his own helplessness pressing down on him. Defeated, he slowly placed the gun back on the floor, his shoulders slumping in resignation. Sandra let out a shaky breath, a tiny spark of hope igniting within her. Maybe, just maybe, they could all walk away from this, battered but alive. But Robert wasn't finished. As Edward looked up, a flicker of dread crossed his face. Robert's expression was unreadable, but the darkness in his eyes spoke volumes. Whatever twisted mercy they thought they had earned was about to be shattered. The game was far from over. Do you know what the worst part of all this is? Robert began, his voice low, each word laced with a controlled fury that sent chills down Sandra's spine. It's not the betrayal, the lies, or even the humiliation. It's that you both thought I was weak. You thought you could do this to me and just get away with it. He shifted his focus to Edward, who instinctively took a step back, his face drained of all color. The bravado he had shown earlier was gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated fear. Robert, please, Edward stammered, desperation creeping into his voice. I'm sorry. I'll do anything. Just don't. But before he could finish, the gun went off. The sound was deafening, a violent crack that reverberated through the room and echoed in Sandra's ears long after the shot had been fired. Edward crumpled to the floor, his eyes wide with shock, a look of disbelief frozen on his face as blood began to pool around his lifeless body, staining the pristine carpet that Sandra had once so carefully maintained. A scream tore from Sandra's throat, raw and filled with horror. Her hands flew to her mouth, trying to stifle the sound, but it was no use. The terror was overwhelming, paralyzing her as she struggled to comprehend what had just happened. The man she had shared so many stolen moments with, who had promised her excitement and passion, now lay dead at her feet. Robert turned to her, his expression unreadable, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions raging inside Sandra. He was never going to walk out of here alive, he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. He was a dead man the moment he crossed me. Sandra's body was trembling uncontrollably, her knees threatening to give way beneath her. Robert, please. I'm sorry. I'll do anything. Just please don't kill me, she begged, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. Robert studied her for a long, agonizing moment, the gun still heavy in his hand. You made your choice, Sandra. You chose him over me. You chose to betray our marriage, to throw everything we had away for a cheap thrill. Tears streamed down Sandra's face as she collapsed to her knees, desperation clawing at her insides. I was wrong, Robert. I know I was wrong. But please, please don't do this. I can change. I'll do anything you ask. Just don't kill me, she pleaded, her voice breaking. For a brief second, Robert's expression softened, the man she had once known flickering beneath the surface. But the years of pain, the endless humiliation, and the deep betrayal were too much for him to forgive. He couldn't let her walk away, not after everything she had done, not after the destruction she had wrought on his life. And yet, as much as he wanted to, he couldn't bring himself to pull the trigger. The love he had once felt for her, now buried deep beneath layers of anger and hurt, held him back. His hand trembled as he lowered the gun, his face hardening once more. "Leave," he ordered, his voice like ice. "Get out of this house, out of my life, and never come back. If I ever see you again, I won't hesitate." Sandra didn't need to be told twice. Scrambling to her feet, she fled, her heart pounding as she ran out of the house, not daring to look back. The night air hit her like a cold slap, but she didn't stop. She kept running, her mind reeling, trying to process the nightmare she had just barely escaped from. Behind her, the house that had once been her home was now nothing more than a memory, a place she would never return to. And in that house, Robert stood alone, the weight of what he had done pressing down on him, heavier than he had ever imagined. The house was steeped in an unsettling silence after Sandra fled. Robert remained rooted in the living room, his hand gripping the gun that had just ended Edward's life. The once vibrant space now felt cold and alien. Edward's lifeless body lay sprawled on the floor, a stark reminder of the violence that had shattered their lives. Robert's breath was heavy and uneven as he stared at the corpse. The adrenaline that had driven him was ebbing away, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. The reality of what he had done was starting to sink in. He had taken a life, crossed a line from which there was no return. The man who had been his boss, his wife's lover, was now a lifeless figure on the carpet. The enormity of his actions felt like a crushing weight on his chest. He sank into a nearby chair, his grip loosening on the gun. The weapon slipped from his hand and clattered to the floor, but Robert barely noticed. His mind was numb, a void where rage and adrenaline had once been. He felt empty, as if the very essence of his being had been drained away, leaving behind only a hollow shell. The minutes dragged on, the silence of the house broken only by the distant, almost surreal sounds of the night. Robert didn't know how long he sat there, lost in a haze of disbelief and regret. The noise of sirens began to pierce through the silence, growing louder with each passing second. The reality of the impending arrival of law enforcement snapped him back to a grim reality. The sirens, the flashing lights, the inevitable questions, they were all coming, and he couldn't escape them. He closed his eyes, trying to shut out the noise, the light, the world outside. He heard the distant wail of the sirens growing closer, the urgent buzz of police radios, and the muted sound of footsteps approaching the house. The once familiar space now felt like a crime scene, tainted by the bloodshed that had occurred within its walls. Robert stood up, his movements mechanical. He glanced around the room, taking in the aftermath of the night's events, the bloodstains, the overturned furniture, the scattered remnants of his shattered life. The house that had once been a sanctuary was now a symbol of his downfall. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the room through the windows, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Robert knew what was coming. The police would arrive, and with them would come the weight of justice, the questions, and the consequences of his actions. He was acutely aware that the life he had known was over, irrevocably changed in a single, horrific night. As the first knock on the door echoed through the house, Robert's heart sank. The finality of the situation was undeniable. He had crossed a point of no return, and there was no escaping the repercussions. The sirens wailed louder, and the urgency of the situation grew more pronounced. He braced himself for the confrontation, knowing that there would be no escape from the reality of his actions. When the police finally burst through the door, Robert was waiting for them, his hands raised in surrender. The officers moved swiftly, their eyes scanning the room, taking in the scene before them. Robert's expression was blank, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. The game was over, and the consequences were about to unfold. In the end, no one had won, only destruction and despair remained.